take your calls. Here's the next panel from Haines Hall.
Okay, welcome. This panel, yeah, exactly. What city are we in tonight? This panel is unhelpfully called The Middle East Facing the Realities, which is more than a little bit broad. I think we're going to try to discuss Iran as much as possible, but we will entertain questions from elsewhere. Before we start, there are a couple of announcements that I'm supposed to make. Cell phones off, please. There will be signings following the session. The signing for this panel is located in the north signing area. That'll be marked Haines 39. Roxana will not be there until 3:45. Everybody else will be there promptly when we're done, right? Yeah. You're not allowed to record the session. We're going to do that for you. You can Twitter away if you want. And I think that's it. We're going to try to keep this as conversational as possible. You're going to hear as little from me as possible, because I'm going to the hockey game tonight. I need to save my voice. I know you'll all be there. So first, just by way of introduction, really, there was really no bigger story last year than the events that went on in Iran. We had, the Iranians faced really a major choice about the future and the nature of their country. There were disputed elections. It was followed by violence in the streets. The roots of a green reformist movement turned into something larger and more and political. All of this, of course, was superimposed upon the ongoing debate about Iran's nuclear program and whether there are attempts to weaponize that program, and if so, what the rest of the world can or should do about it. Now, at the Los Angeles Times, we are pretty proud of our coverage there. Borzu Daragahi is our correspondent who spent an awful lot of time in Tehran. He did some tremendous work there last year and was recognized by the Pulitzer Prize Committee as a finalist for his reporting. One of the secrets of Borzu's success, I think, was that he was able to kind of get beyond the black and white narrative that so often defines this, can often define it on cable TV or in the rhetoric of politicians, and sort of explored the various shades of gray, he just brought a richness to his coverage. And I think that's what our panelists here today are going to be able to do because they're authors. And so they were all going to be able to give us, I think, the different perspectives, but deeper perspectives on what's going on. Roxana's perspective is one that's not really very enviable. She was able to get a taste of the Iranian hardliners from inside a prison. I think it was 100 days he spent in jail. Roxana had been living in Iran since 2003, working as a freelance journalist, was writing a book, ended up writing a very different book. I think maybe we'll ask you about the original book that you were planning to write and how your experiences may have changed, where you want to go with that. Ilan Berman is the Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council.
We have a problem with our live coverage. We're working on it and plan to return to the event shortly.
Born in Tehran, part of the, part of the exile community living here, an Iranian-American writer, member of the faculty of the University of California in Riverside, contributing editor for the Daily Beast, and the author of two books of, I would say, religious scholarship, one called No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam, and the latest is How to Win a Cosmic War, introducing this concept of cosmic war to the debate and the discussion, God, globalization, and the end of the war on terror. So, Reza, maybe we'd start with you, and just the air these days is so filled with a sense almost of inevitability about a confrontation between Iran and the United States. And we're just wondering, in your opinion, are we on a road that leads, is there any prospect of accommodation? Is there any way out, or are we really just heading down that road?
Well, I guess it depends on what the goal is. I mean, if you think that, if you're asking, are we inevitably moving towards some kind of military confrontation with Iran, the answer to that is a definitive no, because there is no military option when it comes to Iran. There's no military option for the United States, and there's no military option for Israel. There's a lot of reasons for this that we can get into in the answer and question period, but I do think that we should all bear in mind that Robert Gates has unequivocally taken the military option off the table. And with regard to this issue about whether Israel is going to act unilaterally, there is no such thing as a unilateral action on the part of Israel when it comes to Iran, for a couple of reasons, the most important of which is that Israel has to go across Iraqi airspace in order to attack Iran, and guess who controls Iraqi airspace? You know, the issue, I think, is one of, if you're talking about sort of inevitabilities here, is it inevitable that Iran is going to weaponize its nuclear program? Nobody knows. Let's just be clear on this right now. The intelligence estimates change on a yearly basis. In 05, 06, the intelligence community in the United States was almost unanimous in its decision that Iran had abandoned its weapons program. 08, 09, that opinion has changed. And as far as Israeli intelligence goes, Israeli intelligence has been saying Iran is 12 to 18 months from a nuclear weapon for 10 years now. So we don't know. That's just the fact. What we do know, however, and what is becoming increasingly clear, is that if Iran actually wants to build a nuclear weapon, and we don't know if they do, but if they want to build a nuclear weapon, it seems like there's very little anyone can do to put a stop to it. And so that means that to deal with Iran's nuclear ambitions, we have to answer two questions. One of them is, why would Iran want a nuclear weapon? And the answer to that, I think, is pretty obvious. I mean, it's meant to be as a security guarantee. It's a deterrent, like every country in the world who wants a nuclear weapon. There's nothing extraordinary, nothing unusual about Iran whatsoever, or about the way that it would use a nuclear weapon if it were to have one. It is, after all, a country that's literally surrounded by American troops. I mean, literally surrounded by American troops. And it's a country that, despite the security threat that Israel faces from it, it's a country that, as we sit here today, has an untold number of Israeli nuclear weapons pointed at it right now. So, it doesn't take a genius to figure out why Iran would want a nuclear weapon. As I sometimes flippantly say, Iran learned a pretty valuable lesson from its fellow Axis of Evil members, right? One of them didn't have nuclear weapons. It was destroyed and occupied. The other one does have nuclear weapons. We're still pouring tens of billions of dollars into North Korea just to get them to talk to us about their weapons. So the first issue is, how do we get them to not want one? The second issue is, I think that if we're going to continue to think of Iran's nuclear program as an Iranian problem, then we will never solve it, because it's not an Iranian problem. It's a regional problem, but more importantly, it's an anti-proliferation problem. And until we can figure out a way to construct a more solid basis for an anti-proliferation regime, something much more solid than the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the primary document that we have right now, we're going to have countries like Iran popping up every few years. I think Barack Obama is right. We are fast approaching a world in which either everyone will have nuclear weapons or no one will have nuclear weapons. And until we figure out which one of those two things we're willing to live with, the problem of Iran will be a problem that we're going to face over and over again throughout the region.
Ilan?
Well, let me amplify a little bit on what Reza talked about, because he actually hit upon some very, very important points with regard to proliferation, with regard to sort of the regional perspective. Let me say this: I'm a talking head in Washington. In lieu of a real job, I sit around and throw ideas at the wall all day. So I wouldn't necessarily say that what you're going to hear from me is representative of the country as a whole, but I do spend a lot of time talking to policymakers in Congress. So I can at least tell you with a little bit of sincerity what they're thinking. And what they're thinking is that there are essentially three choices when it comes to Iran. There's accommodation, the idea that Iran is building a nuclear program and there's not much that we can do about it, and therefore we don't do anything at all. There is the central point, which is containment, which is a fancy way of saying doing nothing. And this essentially takes the paradigm of our fight against the Soviet Union and says, well, the Soviets had nukes and we had nukes and we didn't blow each other up, and so everything's fine. And by the way, that's the job that Congress likes the best because they don't like to do a lot of work. So when they think, oh, wait, if the Iranians just get nukes, then we'll have a stable deterrence paradigm and everything will be fine and we don't have to come in on weekends and we don't have to log in great hours. And they really like this idea. The problem, of course, with the containment paradigm is that Iran is not the Soviet Union. Iran possesses most immediately an ideological component and a religious component that the USSR never did. And so, and also there's a lot of pesky details, like the fact that we don't have steady communications with the Iranians. Like we don't have a good idea of their intentions or their red lines. These were all prerequisites to having a stable deterrent relationship with the Soviets. With the Soviets, we theoretically had an idea that we could figure out more or less what they would do under any circumstance in any given time. And that's what made MAD, mutually assured destruction, that's what made MAD work. We don't have all those components, all those ingredients necessary for stable containment and deterrence of the Iranians. So that option's, I think, fairly problematic. And then on the right side of the spectrum is this idea of confrontation. The idea that a nuclear Iran, whether it's a nascent nuclear program, and you hear a lot about the Japanese model, the model of nuclear development stopping just shy of having an offensive capability so that they can just sprint across the offensive threshold if they feel threatened. This is a little bit academic, I think, because what you're talking about is a country building an infrastructure that supports a nuclear weapons program. And the fundamental choice that we have to make, and let's be clear, I think Reza's right, we haven't made it yet. I think the policy community in Washington is very, very divided, is whether or not we can live with this regime acquiring this capability in this way at this time. The Obama administration has spent the last 15 months or so testing the proposition. And the proposition happens to be, is it possible for us to reach some sort of negotiated accommodation with the Iranians? An accommodation that respects their right to nuclear energy, but at the same time constrains their development and makes it more transparent. And what we've discovered over the last 15 months or so is that it may be, but the ingredients aren't there for us to build that type of paradigm, at least not right now. In fact, what you've been noticing, if you've been reading the press, is that the regime has very deftly used the last year and a little bit more than a quarter of the strategic pause that we've inserted. And I like to use that word because you understand that when diplomacy comes up, threats go down, the possibility of military action goes down, the possibility of sanctions goes down. The regime has used that as a window of opportunity to forge ahead with this nuclear program, including the disclosure of sites like the Qum pilot plant, which is not very useful for energy generation, but really useful if you want to build a nuclear weapon, including disclosure of plans to build a neutron initiator, which is essentially a trigger for a nuclear weapon, which you don't need in a civilian nuclear program. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence there that makes the international community and policy makers in Washington that I talk to very nervous that this isn't just a peaceful program and that they have to do something about it. As Reza said, there's a great deal of plurality and a great deal of problematic elements relating to a military option, as well as relating to economic warfare, as well as relating to sanctions. And I think these are all, we're right in the middle of a very heated policy discussion in Washington about what to do about it. For those of you that haven't paid attention, there is a great deal of congressional action coming down the pike in the next several weeks on precisely this, on whether or not energy sanctions should be levied against Iran, what are the next steps now that diplomacy has broken down. For my money, I think it's all going to boil down to one simple question. It's whether or not we think it's possible, using all these different inducements, to modify the behavior of the current rulers in Iran enough to be livable, or if you need something more fundamental. If the problem is not the nuclear program, but the problem is the regime that wields it, then we have a real problem.
Well, Roxana, you're the only one here who's lived in Iran for extended periods of time. When you hear that kind of talk out of Washington, does it strike you as realistic? Do you think?
Well, I think the problem is that people in the international community just don't really know what exactly to do with Iran. And it seems like the majority view in the West right now is to focus on sanctions on at least Revolutionary Guard entities as the best of the last few remaining alternatives, according to the supporters of these kinds of sanctions. And those supporters say maybe this could impact the Revolutionary Guards to a certain extent without hurting the ordinary people as much as other steps would. I think it is very difficult to predict what sanctions would do in Iran and how the regime would react and how the people would react, if they would rally around the flag or if they would become so dissatisfied and blame their own regime and rise up and put pressure on them. It's very difficult to predict. I think, though, no matter what is pursued, the door to dialogue should always be open. I mean, we've been talking about confrontation, but I mean, I think it's possible to apply pressure, but at the same time, always keep open and sincerely try to have engagement with Iran as well. And when the door to dialogue, if it's closed, this actually plays into hardliners' hands who like to blame America for any lack of compromise on the nuclear issue. And also, sometimes hardliners in Iran like to have this external threat as to further fuel their argument that Iran is under national security threat, and in the name of protecting national security, they can try to silence their critics and opposition in the country, which is what I've seen, and I think what a lot of people have seen over the previous few years. And at the same time, if you close the door to dialogue, it just really shuts, it reduces the possibility of peaceful solution to the tensions.
Yeah. One of the things that's striking, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ilan, but in your latest book, you argue for a strategy that's much broader than just a military confrontation, and one that uses a military option. You argue for broad economic tools, essentially an argument that soft power has to be involved as well. When you read Roxana's book, what's striking is that the suspicion level on the part of the Iranian hardliners when it comes to soft power is very, very high. The work that your affiliation with the Aspen Institute seem to set off all kinds of alarm bells. So the notion that soft power could be used as a tool, it will still encounter this sort of. I mean, they had the same sort of derisive attitude towards community organizers as some Republicans had.
Yeah. And hardliners like to talk about a soft revolution or a velvet revolution as something being masterminded by outsiders, particularly the U.S. government. And they say the argument that they have is that the U.S. government is trying to inject ideas through using Iranian elites like academics and others in society, who would then use civil society and the media to spread these ideas about, I suppose, democracy and human rights to the masses, who would then rise up and try to overthrow the regime in some nonviolent revolution. If you define a velvet revolution like this, I don't know if there's actually such a thing, but I think there is a possibility of ideas spreading that are counter to the interests of the regime, ideas about democracy and human rights. If they do spread more in the population, we have seen them spreading more in the population of Iran, they can be perhaps threatening to the people in government because they don't really want more democracy, because that would mean they would have to share power. But this is not exactly something that's being masterminded by the US government. I think the ordinary Iranian people want it to a large extent. In my case, yes, this argument about soft power, on my first day of interrogation, when I was taken to an unmarked building somewhere in Tehran, one of the questions that I was asked was about a fellowship that I just received from the Aspen Institute Middle East Leadership Fellowship. And I hadn't even gone on it yet. It was supposed to start the next month. And it was aimed at community service. And they said, well, you know what community service is code for? And they meant like soft revolution. And I said, well, actually, we were supposed to set up like programs in our own communities, like soccer teams for kids and stuff like that. And they said, no, the Aspen Institute is getting money from the US government, and it's one of their arms of, one of their weapons in the soft war. And then on another occasion, my main interrogator, whom I call Javan because it means youth in Iran, he was younger than the rest of my interrogators, and the interrogators, because they're intelligence agents, would never give me their real names. He said he was reading the newspaper behind me one day, because I always had to sit facing the wall in this little desk in the interrogation room in Evan Prison. And he was reading about President Obama, who was just inaugurated 11 days before my capture, my arrest. And he said, these Democrats, they talk about engagement with Iran, but actually the Democrats are more dangerous than the Republicans. Because while the Republicans openly call for the regime change in Iran, the Democrats pretend that they want better relations, but they're actually aiming for the same thing, namely through soft revolution. So I don't know to what extent they actually believe that the US government is masterminding this, but I think they are afraid of idea spreading that could threaten their own power.
But you're more optimistic about ideas in Iran, are you not, Reza?
Well, I mean, I think that these ideas are not just spreading, they're pervasive. We keep talking about how to bring democracy to Iran. Iran's already got its democracy. It's just being completely repressed by a shadow government. So everything that Iran needs, absolutely everything that Iran needs for rapid political and social transformation already exists in Iran, except for this one thing, which is that the economy is on the verge of total collapse. 40% of the population living under the poverty line, a 30% official unemployment rate, and most Iranians, and I think Roxana will agree with this, would say that that number is actually much, much higher. 26% annual inflation rate. You're talking about a country that sits on the second largest supply of oil and natural gas on the planet, and yet has to import 40% of its gasoline at a ridiculous loss of profits, and then subsidize that gasoline for pennies per liter. There is no functioning middle class left in Iran any longer, by which we mean this sort of, the leisure class, the class that brought down the Shah in 1979, the class that launched the nationalist revolution in 1953, the class that forced the monarchy to write a constitution and allow for a parliament in 1905. It's always been the middle class in Iran that has pushed forth, these revolutions, these grand transformations. But the middle class in Iran is barely functioning. And just for those of you, this is Los Angeles, so we all know this, but for those of you who don't, when we talk about Iran, we're not talking about, Burma. We're not talking about North Korea. This is not a hermit kingdom. This is a country in which the literacy rate for women alone, just women, is 90%. That matches the literacy rate for women here in the United States. It's an incredibly sophisticated culture, very technologically savvy, socially conscious, politically literate, and globalized. So I think, and I don't want to speak for Ilan here, but when we talk about soft power, we're not saying, we're not talking about these sort of little things, institution buildings. We're talking about grand dramatic gestures of soft power that fundamentally change the socioeconomic status in Iran. One of which, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, one of which is the WTO, allowing Iran to finally join the WTO as it is desperate to do, which forces upon Iran a set of economic and actually socially liberalizing principles that would provide precisely that little crack, the little crack in the door that this 70% of the population needs in order to kick the door down completely.
Well, this is an interesting conversation. Let me start by sort of offering what I think sort of the U.S. Policy community's view is, and then we'll talk about the WTO and all that. I think the question of soft power is probably the one that's least understood with regard to what the United States can do and what the United States has done. The Iranian regime talks a lot about Western forces, insidious foreign forces, trying to promote human rights and democracy, which, by the way, shouldn't sound all that weird to you guys, because we happen to like human rights and democracy, but they don't. And they see it as a challenge to their power because their power is not built upon a connection, a sort of an organic connection between the people and the regime. It's a clerical regime that rules by theological fiat. And it has, Reza talked about Iran having the components of democracy. It does. It has the form of a democracy. What it doesn't have is it doesn't have the substance. And so when we talk about soft power, when we talk about promoting these principles, we're talking about something more fundamental, filling in this form with a substance that will maybe not remove, but certainly alter a regime that, as it currently stands, is very repressive, very unrepresentative. And so the question becomes, what can we do and what have we done? And the answer is not much. When I was writing my book, I had phenomenal access to a lot of the budgetary archives for the Office of Management and Budget. And by the way, for all those of you that are students of U.S. foreign policy, the truest, most direct way to figure out what the U.S. is doing in foreign policy and what it plans to do is to look at the federal budget. And not to look at the federal budget as in, oh, look, there's 1,000 pages that you have to wade through. It's to look at specific programmatic priorities. So wading through the Middle East foreign ops budget, you will find that the Bush administration, for all its talk of democracy in Iran, spent $215 million total in its second term. Iran is a country of 70 million people. So I'm not a mathematician, but that's not a lot of money at all. And if you look at actual funds that were not allocated but were dispersed, you're looking at much smaller. You're looking at a little bit over 38.5 million, right? Which means, roughly a quarter per Iranian over the Bush second term, right? Which is nothing. And so the point is, you can have an intellectual argument about whether or not we should support democracy in Iran, but you can certainly make an ironclad argument that if you're going to do it, you need more funds to do it, right? So the first question is, how much do we really care? How much resource are we going to throw at the problem? The second question is, what are we going to do once we do fully fund this mandate? And the answer here is, and Roxana and I were talking about this when we were having lunch, is there's been a lot of talk about how the Bush administration's democracy outreach to Iran was actually very counterproductive, because it was just enough money to cause those groups that were so desperate that they would accept American funds to crawl out from under the rocks that they were living under, and then they would sort of routinely get snatched up by the regime. And so you would actually have a lot of blowback to U.S. democracy promotion efforts. I would make the argument that the most efficient, the most versatile, and the most effective U.S. soft power is one that leverages what's happening within Iran already and just amplifies it. I'll give you an example. Back in 2003, and Iran is, by the way, in a remarkable state of ferment. Iran is much more dynamic internally with regard to protests, especially now, but historically, in terms of protests, than the Soviet Union was and the Eastern Bloc was at the tail end of the Cold War. You see protests every month. You just don't hear about it here, but you see it in the Farsi language press, you see it in the Arabic language press. So in 2003 was one of those periodic convulsions. It just happened to be far more intense than had previously occurred. There were protests that started at the University of Tehran, and they spread elsewhere. They spread to Isfahan and other places. And a lot of people watching, including myself and people that I work with, thought, well, this is really something, or at least it could turn into something. And what ended up happening was the exact opposite. Over the period of 3 or 4 days, the protests petered out and they died. And so when I was writing my last book, Tehran Rising, I sort of did a little bit of investigative journalism to figure out what happened, because it seemed very abrupt. The answer was that the opposition elements were using NITV. At that time, it was open, right, based in Beverly Hills, an expatriate Iranian broadcaster, to use it to coordinate activities within Iran. And the regime understood this. They know this, that you can receive NITV in Tehran because it's a satellite-based, it was broadcasting based on satellite, and the regime couldn't stop it. And so they turned to the Castro regime in Cuba. And there's a satellite jamming station in Cuba that promptly blocked the satellite, and so that the satellite feed wouldn't go in. And so you essentially decapitated the Iranian opposition movement. So this left me with this idea that perhaps the most effective things that we could do would be to provide enough oxygen for the Iranians to do what they want to themselves, to communicate with each other, to leverage technologies that they currently don't have. This is, by the way, the regime would of course think this is very invasive, but this is just a natural evolution of the protests that you're seeing now in Iran. We just have to think about how to make them more effective.
Go ahead.
On what both of you said. I agree with what you were saying, Reza, that ideas of democracy are already pervasive in society, and they are spreading even more, in my opinion. As we know, many of the Iranian people are young, under the age of 30. They say about 2/3 are under the age of 30, and so they weren't alive at the time of the revolution, or they don't remember it. And they're more and more connected to the world through technology, travel. They have relatives overseas. They've been exposed to ideas about universal human rights. And more women have been going to school. About 65% of entrants of Iranian universities are now women. A lot of them have come from the small towns to the bigger cities like Tehran. And there they get exposed to new ideas as well. And they have greater demands for equality, human rights, and democracy. And it is true that struggle for democracy in Iran has been taking place for more than 100 years. This is one of the main political struggles in the country, has been between democracy and autocracy, whether in the form of a monarchy or a religious government. And also when you're talking about steps, both of you talking about steps about promoting democracy or human rights in Iran, and I don't know if this is also part of soft power, perhaps it is. I agree that there are certain things that people on the outside, governments and ordinary individuals, can do to support the push for democracy and human rights in the country, such as helping to keep the lines of communication open, like through technology. A lot of people have been talking about satellite-based internet technology, and there should be more work done on that. I know Haystack, which Ilan knows, has probably some more information about this because we were talking about it before too, which is an encryption software. It was just allowed, it was given a license by the US government to be offered in Iran, which would technically allow Iranians to surf the internet without being monitored so closely. I think there are also other things that the US government and other governments could do. They could, they don't have to take political sides at all, but they can stand up for universal human rights and principles. And they should do this on a consistent basis, and not just in Iran, but in other countries as well, so Iran can't say that this is a political issue. Also, there is no UN special envoy on human rights to Iran right now. And this is something a lot of human rights activists have been pushing for, but I think America and other countries haven't pushed for it quite hard enough because they're focused on the nuclear issue right now. And maybe they're worried that if they push for support on the nuclear issue from some countries, that those, if they push for support on the human rights issue, that those countries won't support America on the nuclear issue as well. But I think in the long run, it's important and to focus on the human rights issue, because a democratic government that respects human rights in Iran is much more likely to honor or reach some kind of binding, significant nuclear agreement. And just a couple more things. Also, leading by example is very important. My captors, when I was in prison, liked to bring up Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo quite a bit. And as if to say, like, one of, it was the deputy prosecutor, he said, why is it that we hold an American woman here for 1 month and the world cries out violations of human rights, but America has Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo? And then on another occasion, I found out later, my father, after he came to Iran to try to rescue me, he was called into the Tehran Revolutionary Court one day, and by one of the intelligence agents, and the intelligence agent said, why have you been telling the media all the time that your daughter's innocent? Don't you know that she's made a confession? Because I was pressured to make a false confession that I was a spy about America. And my father said, well, we have to see under what conditions did she make this confession? He was implying that I was under a lot of pressure. It was under duress. And the agent said, well, we talked to her in a very friendly environment. Of course, for those of you who don't know, I was taken from my apartment and kept in solitary confinement without an attorney. I wasn't allowed to tell my parents where I was, and I was threatened that I could stay there for up to 20 years or get the death penalty. But I guess that's a friendly environment. And he said, we talked to her in a very friendly environment. This isn't America. We don't waterboard here. So I made this example so that people know that when America doesn't reflect those principles that it has come to be known for in different parts of the world, then certain governments and people in those governments can take advantage of that. And instead of addressing their own shortcomings, they can make an excuse for that. And finally, I think there's a lot that ordinary people can do to help promote human rights and democracy in Iran. There are so many people who are jailed in Iran right now, political prisoners and prisoners of conscience, who are simply there because They have peacefully exercised basic human rights such as freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of religion, and some of these people were my cellmates, and at least 2 of them are still there right now. It makes a big difference for those prisoners who were there when they know that ordinary people on the outside are showing support for them. And it might be in the form of demonstrations. There's going to be a big one coming up here in different cities on June 12th, which is the 1-year anniversary of the election. And I'm sure there will be one in Los Angeles. Signing petitions on Facebook, or writing letters to the Iranian officials at the UN, or asking your media to report more on these issues. And it makes it a lot harder for the hardliners in Iran to say that these are organized by governments when they see ordinary people in different countries taking these kinds of steps.
Ilan, the Washington foreign policy establishment missed the '79 revolution, it misread the fall of the Soviet Union. Recently, it seems like they've been getting China wrong now for the last decade or so. What are the odds of them getting this one right?
As the spokesperson.
Right. Yeah. Right. As I always like to say, I'm not really a card-carrying member of the foreign policy establishment. Right. I'm just a gadfly. So let me say this: very slim, and very slim because there are certain conventional wisdoms that we assume that simply don't apply to Iran. So there was the conventional wisdom, and I'm going to sound like I'm harsh on the Obama administration. I don't intend to be, because I think it was a worthy pursuit. I wouldn't maybe not have dragged it out for 15 months, but the idea of engaging with Iran, I understand the rationale behind testing the proposition. But that proposition is born out of this peculiar hubris that we have. America is so big, so important, that all we have to do is say that we're going to sit at the table, and by the time we get there, there's going to be steak, there's going to be coffee, there's going to be the Iranians on the other side. And you know what? What we've discovered over the last 15 months is Iran's doing just fine, thank you very much. The regime is thriving under these conditions because the regime uses the external threats that it faces from the coalition, the internal threats that it faces from soft revolution, which tries desperately to paint as being foreign orchestrated, to consolidate power, to become even more repressive, even more unrepresentative. So one of our failures has been that we presume that the negotiations with Iran are going to go the way they did with the Soviets, or they're going to go the way they did with the Chinese. Iran is, I don't know how many times I say this a day, but a lot. Iran is not the Soviet Union. Iran is a fundamentally different creature. This sort of gets to the second question. And it's not a settled question, but it's one that's paralyzed the Washington policy establishment, of which I'm not a spokesman, for, about 15 years or so. And that question is whether or not, with sufficient modification, this regime would be okay. Former CIA Director Jim Woolsey likes to use the phrase "close enough for government work." So he would know, right? But what he's talking about is it's not perfect, but it's close enough for government work. So if this regime gave up its nuclear ambitions, if this regime gave up its support for terrorism, which, by the way, the U.S. hasn't flip-flopped on since 1985, when the State Department has been issuing its patterns of global terrorism, Iran has ranked every year as the most active state sponsor of terrorism, using organs like the Revolutionary Guard, supporting groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, more lately Shiite militias in Iraq, etc. Thank you. Because that debate has been so ingrained in Washington, the question of whether or not, if this regime just gives up all these different things, would it be okay? Can we live with them? Or do we need to seek a more fundamental transformation, right? This is the, simplistically put, this is the behavior modification versus regime change argument. Can we live with this regime, or do we need a different one? And what's happened in Washington, as usually happens in Washington, when you have two really heady ideas that come full force at each other, the answer is nothing happens. And nothing's been happening for about a decade and a half. And that debate is still going on. The Obama administration, when it came in, addressed this very obliquely by saying, we're going to have a fundamentally different approach to what the Bush administration was doing. The presumption was the Bush administration really wanted to promote the latter, to promote regime change, and therefore we're going to promote behavioral modification. We're going to talk with these guys and try to change their behavior. But what's happened is that, in current events, history sometimes interferes. So what you had last summer, it's now almost 11 months old, was a fundamental groundswell of discontent in Iran. And it really puts the Obama administration in a very difficult position, because it puts the Obama administration on the wrong side of that revolutionary divide that's taking place within Iran. And how Washington reconciles itself to that remains to be seen. But it's quite clear that that decision hasn't been made yet. And so what we decide, whether we decide that we're going to ignore the Green Movement and continue to ignore the Green Movement and talk with the powers that be in Tehran, or whether we're going to talk to the powers in Tehran and try to talk to the Green Movement and therefore appear inauthentic to both, or we're going to talk to the Green Movement to the exclusion of talking to the regime in Tehran, that's going to determine everything, because it's going to tell everybody in the world, including the Iranians, what America would like Iran to look like. It doesn't mean Iran's going to end up that way, but it means that we still have to make a decision.
Reza, do you think that the Green Movement is still strong? And do you think the exile community really understands what's going on inside there now, given the paucity of information that's coming out?
No, I don't think the exile community has a clue what's going on in Iran. I think the exile community, and I speak as one of them, is more concerned about what they want for Iran than what's best for Iran. And it's a real shame upon the Iranian Americans that they can't get past, for the most part, their own ideological divisions, and to sort of think about, okay, well, I've got aunts and uncles and cousins and family who are actually living in Iran who need help, who need assistance right now. So no, I'm not very optimistic about the role that the exile community can play. On the flip side of this, no, I think the Green Movement is absolutely strong. I mean, there's a literary conference here, a literary festival here. So let me just paraphrase the great Mark Twain and say that reports of the demise of the Green Movement have been greatly exaggerated. First of all, I just want to remind everybody that, we keep talking about the revolution of 1979. The revolution of 1979 started in 1977. It took a long time to get rid of the Shah. And it's going to take a long time to promote fundamental political change in this regime. But the truth is that the Green Movement has been more successful than I think anyone could have possibly imagined in doing what they were fundamentally united in doing, which was to delegitimize the regime. To understand that the Islamic Republic bases its legitimacy on two fundamental factors. The first being that it sees itself as the locus of Islamic morality. It's the sort of the center of religious morality in the state. That has been completely and utterly shattered, not just by the rapid takeover of the Revolutionary Guard. Iran is becoming a military dictatorship. It is slowly transforming from a theocratic country to a military country. And I think that's something that we need to be more cognizant of. And secondly, also in the way that they responded, not just to these unarmed civilians on the streets, but to some of the most respected religious authorities in Iran. I mean, brutally going after them, beating them on the streets, arresting their children. The widespread reports that every Iranian had access to about the torture and the rape of prisoners in Iran's prisons. All of that has, even amongst the so-called pious classes, the sort of majority of Iranians who are fairly apolitical and not very socially conscious, but who nevertheless see the state as the bearer of Islamic values, it's completely shattered that sense of legitimacy. The second thing that the government uses to legitimize its regime is popular sovereignty. Make no mistake, despite the autocratic tendencies of this regime, it is scared shitless of its own people. And every single time, Ilan is absolutely right. We just sort of paid attention this last time, but every 18 months or so, there's some massive uprising somewhere in Iran. And despite the brutality of the response, what you see immediately afterwards is these subtle changes in the way that the regime deals with whatever the situation was that caused the uprising to begin with. So this is a government that really relies on this sense of popular will, popular sovereignty for its legitimacy. I don't need to tell you how fundamentally that has been completely shattered. So if the goal of the Green Movement, and I believe it was to delegitimize the regime in the eyes of the majority of Iranians who didn't even join the Green Movement, then they've succeeded beyond their wildest dreams.
We have a few minutes left, and we'd like to open it to questions if you are willing. Let's, no speeches, please. I have a hourglass app here on my phone, and we'll cut them off. And why don't we start from here? Go ahead.
It has been reported that Admiral Mullen, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, traveled to Israel and warned them, if you attack Iran, do not try to mousetrap us, the United States, into this war. Is this true? And are you concerned that Israel will try to get us or mousetrap us? And what did he mean by mousetrap? I think he used the example of the USS Liberty.
Yeah, I think the Liberty has been brought up a couple of times. Yeah.
And you can help to, well, and do you fear that Israel, who I understand has been trying to get us to attack Iran, will attack Iran and then have problems and say, help us, help us, help us? And what will the consequences of a war with Iran be?
Yeah, everybody has an opinion on this issue. Let me just sort of lay it out as simply as I can. Not only can Israel not afford to attack Iran without at least implicit American support, which may come, but it has to do so for two reasons. One, it needs American ships in order to refuel on the way back. And also it has to go over Iraqi airspace, which is controlled by the United States. And I'll just go ahead and quote the great Zbigniew Brzezinski in saying that, friend or foe, you do not violate American airspace. We will shoot you down. You know, we're not going to sit down like he described it as little babies and watch our airspace be violated. The second thing too is that as Thomas Ricks, the great sort of military reporter for the Washington Post, says, and I think he's absolutely right, when Israel wants you dead, you just die. They don't talk about it. They don't mention it. One day you're asleep, and the next thing you know, you're dead. And the fact that we have seen this ratcheting up of rhetoric about an impending military attack from Israeli politicians against Iran is probably the best proof that there is no military attack coming. As far as the consequences, everybody knows the consequences. Iran cannot harm Israel in any conventional sense. Iran is a third world country. Its army is a joke. Its weapons system belongs in the 20th century. But it has two proxy armies in the region, Hezbollah and Hamas, both of whom have proven that they can do significant damage to Israel, and both of which would be let loose should there be an Israeli attack.
Oh, where to start? I think there's a lot here that requires commenting. I'm going to try to keep it as simple as possible. First of all, in order to understand what the Israelis are driving at, you have to understand what Iran represents to the Israeli body politic. If you go to Israel, you find a very divided electorate that disagrees on everything from healthcare to food subsidies to social services. On Iran, whether you're Labour or Likud or Kadima, there's pretty much a continuity. It's a continuity because Iran is seen as an existential threat. Now, you can argue about whether or not it should be. That's fine. But you have to understand that the Israelis view Iran as an existential threat. And it's fueled by the rhetoric from some of the more, I wouldn't use crazy, but the more Brinksman-like among Iran's leaders who talk about wiping Israel from the map. Whether or not that's a question of interpretation or translation, that's a different story. The Israelis read it as the Iranian president wants to wipe Israel off the map. So if you are an Israeli politician, you are driven by what Tip O'Neill used to say, right? All politics is local. And the Israelis see a country that, whether empirically or not, it can reach out and harm Israel. Intellectually, they understand that a state, a Jewish state, built upon the extermination of 6 million Jews by the Third Reich, simply has a problem with sitting by idly and not addressing this in its electorate. I would remind you guys here that Israel is the only country in modern history to denuclearize not one but two countries. So I wouldn't be so quick to say that Israel doesn't have a military option. The question, as always, is And this is a logistical issue. If you look at what the Israeli procurement patterns, the procurement patterns for the Israeli military, they've been spending a lot of time buying additional long-range fuel cases for airplanes, bombs that can penetrate, conventional ordnance that can penetrate hardened and buried targets like, Iranian nuclear facilities. So it's not that planning isn't going on. The question of whether or not it's actually going to happen really hinges upon one thing and one thing alone: whether or not they think Washington is serious. Because the reason the Israelis have been talking for a decade about the fact that Iran is so close to a nuclear weapon, and I agree, this has really served them poorly in terms of framing the Iranian threat. But what they've been trying to do for a long time is to try to recast Iran not as just a local or a regional threat, but as a threat to global security. And I think there's a lot of very good reasons to agree with that definition. The question is whether or not we're going to do something about it. For a long time, the United States government, whether under President Clinton or under President Bush, we talked about the fact that the Israelis, you guys need to hang back. We got it. It's taken care of. We're going to we're going to build a coalition to contain. We're going to build a coalition to sanction. What's happened over the last 15 months has cast serious doubt in the Israeli mind as to whether or not we're serious. Quite frankly, they don't think we are. And as a result, what they do next is more of an open question than it would have been before. Because if they see it as an existential threat and they don't think we're going to take care of it for them, or we're going to help manage it, then this is a wild card in the deck that I think a lot of people have trouble putting odds on.
Sir. Thank you for taking my question. First of all, let's talk. I'd like to second what the lady was asking about an attack on Iran for Israel. Let's look at what the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, the pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC, had recently done with our Congress. Dr. Stephen Snegoski, the author of the Transparent Cabal book, he talked about how the neocons got us to invade Iraq for Israel. He has an article over at america-hijack.com titled "The Israeli Lobby and a War in Iran." AIPAC is pushing for this war. I don't know if you've seen Ron Paul's recent statement on the floor of the House. He said it's basically the building blocks of a war with Iran, like we went to war with Iraq.
And the question is,
we don't
sir,
need it.
The question is?
Yeah. What are your views about AIPAC, again, the pro-Israel lobby, pushing us into another war for Israel, this time with Iran? Thank you.
I guess that's to me. I don't think that's a correct characterization. In fact, if you look at what AIPAC's been doing, and AIPAC's, I agree, very influential, and they're very concerned about the Iran issue, but AIPAC's major lobbying effort for the last 2.5 years has been something called IRPSA, the Iran Refined Petroleum Sanctions Act. The idea here is to sanction the 40% of refined petroleum. Iran has a gasoline shortage. Iran can't refine enough of its gasoline internally, so it buys from abroad, and it buys from a very small number of suppliers. Reliance in India, France's Total, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's all very well known. The idea is to draft legislation in Congress that would allow the U.S. government to sanction these entities, to make it harder for Iran to buy gasoline from abroad as a way of putting pressure on the regime to bring them to the table to avoid military conflict. The goal here isn't to create a military conflict. If it was to create a military conflict, you could probably find less roundabout ways of doing it. What they're looking for is trying to find the magic bullet that will really capture the attention of the rulers in Iran and focus their attention. And really, by the way, this is not an AIPAC question. This is a U.S. sort of foreign policy establishment question. What is that mix of carrots and sticks that can convince the Iranian regime that in order for them to stay in business, they have to get out of the nuclear business? That is a question that AIPAC is asking, but they're certainly not the only one. There's a lot of institutes, both and lobbying groups, both left and right and center, that are asking the same questions. AIPAC, to folks who like to talk about a conspiracy, is certainly the most low-hanging fruit because they're very influential and they have done a lot of work in Congress. But you got to understand that making the Iran issue a neocon issue greatly distorts what Iran is seen as in Washington itself.
I just want to say, I also am not a conspiracy theorist when it comes to AIPAC. Yes, of course, they're enormously successful. And yes, they do threaten congressmen and senators with towing their party line, or they'll be destroyed. And they've done that many times. But that's how it works. That's how Washington works. And good for AIPAC for figuring out how to get on top of this. So it's not a conspiracy issue here. And it's certainly absolutely 100% not the case that AIPAC forced America into the war with Iraq Because the truth is that AIPAC for the last decade has always said Iraq's not the problem, Iran is the problem. And a war in Iraq would only empower Iran. Guess what? They were right. But let's get something absolutely straight here. International law states unequivocally that if you cut off a country's supply to natural resources, it is an act of war. AIPAC knows this very clearly. So they have been pushing to get the United States to essentially dry up Iran's access to this 40% that I was telling you about. But Iran has said unequivocally that any attempt to do so will be seen as an act of war. They will immediately close the Strait of Hormuz, which, by the way, we will consider an act of war because it cuts off our oil supply. So this is indirectly a push towards a military response. Nobody in AIPAC, nobody I've ever spoken to who has any real association with AIPAC actually believes you can talk to Iran, let alone talk to them out of their nuclear program. So I'm a little bit more cynical about their role here with regard to Iran.
To preface a very short question, Roxana's, your experience resonates with this, and leading by example. Over 250 days ago, 3 young Americans living in the Middle East accidentally crossed over the Kurdish border. They've been held in Evin prison since. Very little contact, very little media exposure, very provocative behavior. What is your view?
Yeah, it's awful that the hikers have been held there for so long. They haven't been able to see a lawyer once. They've been able to call home only once. They were in solitary confinement for a long time. Now the 2 boys, Shane and Josh, are together, and Sarah is in solitary confinement, but apparently she gets to see the boys just once for a few minutes a day. But the news last week, what the families had reported, because the Swiss ambassador finally got to see the 3 again, was that at least 2 of them, their physical conditions are not good, and Sarah is suffering from depression. I think they're being used as political pawns, which is unfortunate. It's not a legal case, but a political case and a human rights case. President Ahmadinejad himself suggested a prisoner swap. If the Iranian authorities really thought these guys were spies, why would they, be suggesting this? But Iran likes to call everybody spies, almost everybody. And another thing, just if I try to explain what might be going through these hikers' minds, is probably they're feeling a lot of uncertainty. I'm sure they wish they could see their families. I was lucky because my father had an Iranian passport, and so did my mother. So they could come to Iran and see me after they found out where I was, 'cause for a long time they didn't know. And I could see them once a week. And so they were my outlet to the outside. But when you're in there, cut off from the world, you can't see a lawyer, you can't talk to your family, you feel helpless. And their captors know this, I'm sure.
Theirs is hardly covered at all.
Yeah. And perhaps if I'd stayed in prison for 250 days, my story would not have been covered so much, because, I mean, how often can you have a headline? Like, every day is kind of tough. But yeah, their families, I think, are doing as much as they can to bring attention to the hikers' cases. And if you could help in any way, their website is freethehikers.org. And the families say sometimes the hikers can get letters that are sent, and this really helps uplift them. Also, I think the families have incurred a lot of costs because they have to take care of the expenses and sometimes travel to New York to do interviews about their kids. So, and sometimes they hold vigils. So if you join the Free the Hikers Facebook page as well, you can be up to date with that.
My question is, given that you said the $38 million that we recently spent on Iran was not very effective, and given the idea that us spending money there, would give Iran a reason to say we need nuclear weapons because America is intervening, why should we be spending any money at all over in Iran?
Well, it's an interesting question, and there's that old, and I have to revert back to I'm a recovering lawyer, so I have to revert back to my legal training. The questions of conditions being necessary or sufficient. Just because we spent a little poorly allocated funds towards Iran and it was ineffective and counterproductive, doesn't mean that all funds spent in a more robust fashion, in a more targeted fashion, would necessarily be so. It's clear that the track record for democracy promotion within Iran so far has been abysmal. And it's been abysmal, I think, because it tried to do a couple of things. It tried to focus on groups that were very publicly known and also, as a result, very vulnerable to exploitation by the Iranian regime, to essentially dismemberment.
I mean, why do we need to promote democracy at all? Like, what,
Well,
why don't we just leave them alone?
Okay. Well, no, it's a very legitimate question. I think, and I don't know if I'm an outlier here. I have no idea. I'm from the East Coast. I don't know anything. But it seems to me, but what I am is I'm a product of Soviet repression. My parents were refuseniks during the Cold War, and they came out. And I can only go by their experience. Their experience was that when the West talked about human rights and democracy, universal values, the dissidents within the Soviet Union received an enormous shot in the arm. Their status was internationalized. The Soviet Union sat up and took notice. And when you begin to leverage things, like, for example, most favored nation trading status, which is what the Jackson-Vanik Amendment did in the early 70s, and said to the Soviets, you can't be a country and trade with others like a normal country because you don't treat your people normally. And the Soviets responded to this. This resonated with them because they wanted to trade with the West. They desperately wanted to trade with the West. When you can create that magic mix of pressure that convinces a regime which, left to its own devices, is very repressive, that treating its own people more humanely is not only good for those people, it's good for it, that's when you really have something. And I think that's a goal that, frankly, I mean, the United States was built upon these principles. Not promoting them or promoting them selectively seems like a step backward, right? We want Iran to be less of a threat and not a threat at all to the United States. The Green Movement is saying that they want a fundamentally different regime that doesn't repress them, that is more pluralistic. There seems to be a meeting of the minds at a very fundamental level that, frankly, we should do something about.
I think some Iranians at least do want there to be an outcry about human rights violations in Iran. They want, for example, some of the demonstrators, they were yelling, Obama, Yabuna, Yabamas. It was like this. Yeah, Obama, either you're with them or you're with us, because they thought he was being very quiet on the issue of human rights violations. But supporting democracy in Iran doesn't mean that, like, you should support specific groups or name groups that you will support, or especially groups inside Iran, because that allows the hardliners there to claim that ordinary, activists, journalists, human rights campaigners are mercenaries of the U.S.
Well, imagine this, an invigorating, impassioned discussion about the Middle East. Unfortunately, our time is up. I feel very badly for those of you who waited to ask questions. I want to thank the panelists very much for coming today. You guys were tremendous.
The history of terrorism in the region involves the United States intelligence agencies and Israeli agencies. And to talk about the United States government exporting democracy is absurd. The United States has undermined democracy in the region since it overthrew the Mossadegh. Is that true or not? Do we think the United States government has changed its ways now? It doesn't represent democracy.
I'd have to do the interview, so if you can talk to
Look into false flag terrorism. The United States government is supporting the MEK, which is a terrorist group right now, to try to destabilize the Iranian government. The Israeli government tried to do false flag terrorism against the United States back in the 50s and blame it on Arabs. So the history of terrorism, it goes much deeper in terms of the United States and Israel rather than Iran.
Please exit the building. You will find the panel at the north signing area. Out of this building to your right, the next walkway, make a right and then quickly go left. You will find them in the north signing area.
And you've been watching our last live panel of the day from the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books. Reza Aslan, Ilan Berman, and Roxana Saberi were all participating in that panel. And in fact, as we continue our live coverage, up next, a live call-in program from Los Angeles on the campus of UCLA. You can see the crowd still there. Roxana Saberi will be here talking about her captivity in Iran. The name of her book is Between Two Worlds: My Life in Captivity in Iran. She'll be taking your calls as we get her seated here on our set right outside of Haines Hall where that event was held. If you want to dial in and talk with Roxana Saberi, 202-585-3885 for those of you in the East and Central time zones. 202-585-3886 if you live in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. And you can also send a tweet, twitter.com/booktv. By the way, everything that you've seen today will re-air tonight at 1 a.m. Eastern Time on Book TV. The entire 5.5 hours of programming that we've covered today will all re-air as one entire package. And that is, of course, 10 p.m. here on the West Coast. So we will be right back with Roxana Saberi.
We're at Frostburg State University speaking with Robert